Another Ralph. I'm Ralph Meranto Jr., and I'm going to talk about Ralph Meranto Sr. There are a lot of stories I could tell about my dad, but the one I'm going to tell today is about the last time I saw him. My dad and I were a lot alike. I mean, look at the picture. This wasn't staged. Right? We weren't alike in every way, but we were alike in many ways. Like our love of puns and corny jokes. Like if we were driving down the highway and driving through a construction zone and you saw a sign on the side of the road that said low shoulder, there was a pretty good chance that we were both simultaneously gonna go. Or a tendency to burst into song whenever somebody would randomly mention some obscure lyric from some old song. Like at Thanksgiving, you would say, pass the salt, and Dad would sing, salt, who sells salt? Now, I have absolutely no idea if that's a real song. He swore it was. I have Googled it. I can't find it anywhere. And if I did really hear it, it probably doesn't sound like that, and I would be like, no, they're singing it wrong. It goes, salt, who sells salt? One time I did a bit like that, and my sister-in-law looked at me, my brother, and my dad, and said, 3 people, 1 brain. But it was much more than his sense of humor or his eternal optimism that we had in common. We're also both people pleasers. We always are the one to volunteer, to take on a project. When I played Little League, Dad was the coach. When I started doing the school plays, Dad was there to help build the sets. We're also very stubborn about letting others see us as weak. And I don't mean that in like the macho way, like no one's ever accusing either of us of being macho guys. But I mean that in the way of like refusing to admit when you need help. The way of, oh yeah, I got this, when clearly you don't. So when my dad started having serious health problems and actually admitted that he needed help, we knew it was serious. So Dad lived in Niagara Falls, and the doctors there spent years struggling to diagnose his heart troubles. Eventually, he went to a heart doctor in Buffalo who recommended that he come to Rochester and go to Strong, where they were eventually able to diagnose him with a condition called amyloidosis, which is basically excess protein in the blood can damage the organs, and in his case, the heart. Now, because I live an hour and 45 minutes away, I was never directly involved in my dad's medical care, so I was glad to take my turn as a son and help him out through this process when he would come up to Rochester. I was also glad to have a little bit of time with him, one-on-one, without the rest of the family around. Yeah. After appointments at Strong, we would go to Phillips European for lunch. Dad loved his sweets, and my mom and I share a love of their peanut butter torte. At Strong, an amazing team diagnosed the problem and also got him on a new experimental drug, and it seemed to be helping, but the drug doesn't reverse the damage that had been done, and the amyloidosis at that point had taken its toll. Eventually, he ended up in the ICU in Buffalo General, and then they, after like almost 2 weeks, released him to rehab. Now, we thought, okay, that's a sign that things are getting better. What we didn't realize at the time was it was a sign that the hospital felt they had stabilized him enough, they needed to move him out because they needed the bed because it was the height of COVID. They took him to the rehab center, and because it was the pandemic, visitors were not allowed at the hospital or at the rehab center. But an incredibly, incredibly kind nurse manager there called my mom and said, I think you need to gather the family. So I got the call. The whole time I'm driving there, an hour and 45 minutes, I'm just thinking, hang on, Dad, I will be there soon. To my surprise, when I walked in the room, Dad was alert and energized and smiling and holding court with my brothers and laughing. And I was like, okay, false alarm. I guess Dad is not dying today. But I decided to stay because I knew that even though he was rallying, I thought this might be the last time I get to see my dad. My mom and I spent the whole day with him. I can't say that the conversations were incredibly insightful. He would sleep and wake up and sleep and wake up, and each time it seemed like he was getting more and more uncomfortable. At one point, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "I'm dying, aren't I?" And I honestly think it was probably the first time it had actually occurred to him. Eternal optimist, right? My reply was simply, "Probably, and that's okay." As the day continued, his focus was drifting somewhere else. He would look up at the ceiling and raise his arms up as if he was reaching for something or someone. Clearly, he was feeling something or seeing something that the rest of us couldn't see. I tried to ask him about it, but when I did, I just disturbed him and he looked at me confused, as if I had pulled him away from something. Okay, I'm reading into this, right? I am not a religious person. I don't believe in the image of heaven as a literal place with pearly gates and family and friends standing there waving you, welcoming you. But God and religion were very important to my dad. So who am I to question what is real and what he was experiencing? To me, it felt like he was reaching up to help his spirit exit his failing body. Other times, he would recite random groups of 3 numbers. 27, 34, 18. Okay, those weren't the real numbers. I don't remember what the real numbers were. I have a terrible memory for numbers, so as quickly as he said them, they went out of my head. But what did these random numbers mean? Was he giving me the Powerball numbers? Jeez, I hope not, because I don't remember what they were. Was he calling that football play that was going to help the Bills win the Super Bowl? I really think one of Dad's biggest regrets was dying before he could see the Bills win the Super Bowl. Were they, as the nurse said, meaningless? He was just hallucinating from the pain meds. Maybe something else. As the day continued, it was clear that his morning rally was an adrenaline kick, having his children there. And as I said, Dad did not like to show weakness. He didn't want people to take care of him. He was the one who always took care of everyone else. After a while, it was clear my dad was more in his own thoughts, and it was getting late. So I asked my mom if I could have a moment alone with him. I took just a few seconds to tell him I loved him and to thank him for being an incredible dad. He looked at me, so I hope he heard me. I was pretty sure that was going to be the last time I saw my dad. What I didn't know is that it was going to be the last time any of us saw my dad. Later that night, we got the call that Dad had passed in his sleep. And I thought to myself, yep, that makes sense. There was no way he was going to give up on living with his family in the room. He had to do that alone. Or maybe not alone. Maybe with whomever or whatever he was reaching for. I miss my dad. I wish he was still here. But because of that last day, I really am at peace with it. Thank you.